So now we'd like to share a couple of fragments from the book, and Chip had a suggestion that we each choose a fragment of the book that in some way represents the other person to us. So I would choose a fragment about Chip that is representative of Chip and vice versa. So I'm curious what Chip chose.
One of the passions in my life happens to be history. And so, as interesting as I find these models to be, I find the history of things to be even more interesting. And the selection that I chose actually is a combination of history and of character. And it's in the last chapter, and it's how Agnieszka came to America. "Where's Grandma?" I would ask as a child. "She's in the garden," was the answer, regardless of when or whom I asked. My grandmother was always in the garden. To be precise, she was always hard at work, weeding endless rows of vegetables, pruning black currant, red currant, or gooseberry bushes, attending to her fruit trees, and harvesting all the vegetables and fruits that ripened over the summer and fall. Grandma's days were literally filled with hard physical labor from dawn to sundown. Not an inch of soil went unused, and nothing ever went to waste. She loved every patch of earth in her garden and every plant that grew in it. We admired Grandma, but none of us tried to match her industriousness. People in the village said she was ambitious. It took me some time to figure out the secret of why she worked so hard. She did it because it was her garden of happiness. It would not be an exaggeration to say that I grew up in Grandma's garden. It was magical in many ways, although I did not realize that until much later. My grandmother purchased the land toward the end of World War II and moved there after the Germans evacuated the city of Warsaw and the repercussions of the uprising of 1944. She and Grandpa had to leave the apartment with the few belongings they could carry, and they escaped to a bare field they owned some 20 kilometers to the west. They eventually built a house and planted trees, and after the war ended and the communists took over, my grandma became an independent farmer in a country where the state owned and dictated everything except small farms. Grandma seized the opportunity and Grandpa went with the flow, becoming her somewhat reluctant supporter. The garden fed us, provided refuge and freedom, and became prized real estate that continues to benefit our family to this day. When I was a kid, I used to think of Grandma's garden as a place in the middle of nowhere, which in all truth it was. I had to go there because my parents insisted on it. We lived in a city, but my father would send my mother and me to spend spring and summer in the countryside. At first, I slept in my baby carriage, which was placed in the middle of the vegetable patches as my mother and grandmother worked in the field. Later, I crawled between the rows of vegetables because in Grandma's garden, there was no grass. Every inch of soil was used to produce something. As a toddler, I chased the chickens in the yard, and as I grew up, I helped pick the berries and weed the carrots. The country life felt like an exile when I was a bit older. I had no friends and very few toys. If I wanted entertainment, I had to resort to my own imagination. My favorite game was to pretend that I was going to an English school. I picked the furthest corner of the orchard and marched under the apple trees armed with a few English books my father had given me. He had taken up English around the time I was born, and he tried to teach me some of the language. The fact that there was another world where people spoke and lived differently, as evidenced by the pictures, made a strong impression on me from early on. My grandmother's garden was fine, but the world beyond had much greater allure. When I was in high school, I overheard her say to my mother, "Zabiznek," referring to my brother, "will stay here and take over. Agnieszka will go into the world." It did not seem to be an issue for Grandma that we lived behind the iron curtain. that our country was under the Soviet and communist rule, or that we did not have any relatives abroad who I could possibly even visit. She just voiced what seemed like a logical conclusion for our family situation. I never thought Grandma's words would become prophetic, but as I pursued English, I happened to attend a high school with an expanded English program. It also happened that the school invited an American teacher, and he taught my 9th grade English class. His name was Jim Bernhardt. And years later, he became a professor at a small liberal arts college in the Midwest. I became a freshman at the English department of Warsaw University and continued exchanging occasional postcards with him. And then in 1981, I received a letter from Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota. I know where St. Peter is. I don't know if any of you do. It's kind of hard to get there from here. An institution I had never heard of that soon grew to love very much. The college granted me a full scholarship to study in the United States. The opportunity that Jim created on his own initiative and the opportunity that the college community made happen felt like the equivalent of winning $1 million. It made my dream living in an English-speaking country possible. It opened up a door to a new world that helped me become who I am today. I remain forever grateful for their gift. At the time when I received the fateful letter, however, I needed to get a U.S. visa. Much to my surprise, 1 month before my planned departure, the American Embassy denied my application. Several visits to the embassy later, one of the consuls finally squared with me. Listen, you're young and single. We don't want you to stay in America. I felt devastated. So I kept coming back and knocking at different doors. Finally, another consul made a concession. If your family presents a bank statement with the funds of $4,000, we'll grant you a visa. In 1981 Poland, $4,000 was a small fortune. Needless to say, my family did not have the money. Never giving up on a challenge, my father turned to relatives and friends for help, and he didn't have much luck. Times were hard and uncertain. It was already August of 1981, and Europe was on the brink of a major political shift. Anti-communist strikes had later triggered the collapse of the Soviet Empire escalated across Poland. There were rumors of Russian tanks surrounding the Polish borders. Stores were empty. There was no food to buy. And then the worst possible thing happened for our family. My grandmother, the family matriarch, became so ill that we had to take her to the hospital. I can see that hospital room as if I were standing in it yesterday. A huge open ward with 20 or more beds standing in rows, filled with human pain and misery. How are things? My grandmother asked when I visited her. She looked frail. Her once thick hair that I loved brushing and arranging into different hairdos, playing hairdresser, was now thin and stuck together in dirty grayish strands against a white pillow. I hated to give her the bad news. It looks like I won't be able to go, Grandma. The Americans want us to have $4,000 in the bank. I noticed that the chocolate-covered cookies with the fruit filling that I brought her the day before lay on the bedside table untouched. They were her favorite. And it took some doing to get them in a city where the grocery stores were empty. In the back of my mind, I registered how sick she must be if she couldn't even eat her favorite cookie. Oh, you'll go, she said with conviction, as if she were still her old self. You will go. I don't remember if I believed her, but the strength of her spirit fooled me into believing that she might be all right. The women in the beds next to her seemed to confirm it. Your grandma's the life of the party here. She's telling us all kinds of stories about her life. We all love Mrs. Prolinska. I love my grandma too, and seeing her so vulnerable and weak was heartbreaking as well as shocking. After all, she had been the woman we looked up to for strength, a woman who overcame the most difficult obstacles. Born in 1905 in a village under Tsarist rule, she survived a motherless childhood and eventually built the life that I told you. When World War II broke out, the life she had created collapsed overnight. Under the falling bombs and the risk of being killed at the hands of the Germans, she made soap, she made candles, she made moonshine, and even raised pigs in the cellar of a Hitler-Jugend headquarters. She let the pigs drink some moonshine to keep them happy and quiet. She bartered her soul, what she had, to help her family survive the Nazis, figure out how to live, this time in a totalitarian regime. And I never heard her complain about it when she would tell the stories. Did she consider herself happy? I missed the chance to ask her. Grandmother died a few days later on the afternoon of August 31st, 1981. I arrived 20 minutes after she had passed. Her body was still on the bed, covered with a sheet. "She's gone," the other patients told me as I made my way through the huge room. In disbelief, tears poured out from me, and despair shook my body. And then I felt her presence, first above me and then all around, as if she were embracing me with her love, as if she was giving me the final hug goodbye. The funeral was 4 days later, and my father's uncle, who I had not seen in years, came unexpectedly to the service. He was Grandma's godson. He heard about my predicament, and he offered to loan us the $4,000. The next day we met downtown at the bank. He had $4,000 in cash in one pocket and a gun in the other. I was on the plane to New York City 5 days later and arrived in St. Peter, Minnesota, the day before classes started.
Thank you, Chip.
Thank you.
I tried not to cry. I've chosen a fragment that, in my mind, shows Chip in his fullest glory. How he interacts with people, and especially representative of how he interacted with me. And that's the kind of conversations that I had with Chip that made me decide that I had to write this book. I was curious to hear what Chip had to say about recovering from bad relationships, a growing epidemic in a world that is supposedly more and more connected. How does one heal from painful relationships? I asked during one of the conversations. Are you asking me about healing from a bad relationship or from a lost relationship? Chip asked. I thought for a second. Both, I decided. Okay, to heal from a bad relationship, the first step is to get out of it. So now we're talking about healing from a lost relationship, said Chip, smiling. I laughed at his logic. When it comes to a lost relationship, continued Chip, there's this thing about converging emotions. I related well to Chip's description of an embattled heart. To start with, there is pain about the person's absence. Then there is anger with the person for being gone, even if you're the one who decided to leave. Then there is anger over what happened in the relationship, compounded with your own sense of guilt and sometimes shame. When you're recovering from a lost relationship, observed Chip, you start with a tangled ball of emotional strings. The first step is to respond to that experience so that you know what it is that you're really feeling and why. So, in other words, I paraphrase, healing starts with recognizing my feelings and acknowledging them. Yes, Chip exclaimed. I'm angry with him because, or I'm angry with me because, I missed her because, I feel guilty because, I'm scared because. As you unravel these emotions, you give yourself a chance to work through them. By identifying the reasons, you also start developing a realistic picture of that relationship. Once you have that, you can start setting some goals for the future. So we're back to setting goals as a way of recovering from pain and fear, I noted. Of course, said Chip. Now, setting goals for the future requires you to consider several questions. 1. How am I going to continue my life in a meaningful way without this person? 2. What do I need to do to manage my future interactions with that person? 3. How will I be able to tell when I'm ready to start building a new relationship? 4. What have I learned from this relationship? 5. What have I learned from this relationship about myself? We're back to taking responsibility for our own actions, I concluded. Isn't that obnoxious? And simple. If you're in a toxic relationship, part of taking responsibility is ending that relationship. To heal, it's taking responsibility for lessons learned. I nodded. What are some of the key lessons you learned from your past relationships? Asked Chip. I was silent, thinking. If you care to share that, of course, he added. Oh, you know me better than I know myself, I laughed after a moment of reflection. I guess I learned at least 2 big lessons. One is that I cannot allow myself ever again to run into any relationship for safety from my own fears. Another one is to never confuse hormones with love. Good lessons, said Chip. And this fragment also illustrates what this book is about. The main message of the book is that asking questions is so much more important than the answers. And if you notice his technique, I ask him a question, and he asks me a question back. And then we talk, and then I think I have some clarity. And then at the end, bam, he asks the last question that gives me the largest insight ever.